Thank you for coming to Story Songs, a presentation on a project-based learning inquiry through an artist in residency. We'll be using the subjects of English language arts, marked as ELA, music, and drama. Story Songs is an 8-week artist in residency unit, and it will culminate in a performance. We will be working this time with grade 4 students, and the residency is in a school with a majority of Spanish-speaking students from immigrant families. So that's just to give us a little contextual understanding of this inquiry and engagement, the setting. Story Songs is a residency that my community music school offers to many Chicago public schools, usually through grant-based initiatives. Students in all Story Songs create original music. It's usually based on some kind of text or book that is appropriate for their grade level. It's definitely supposed to connect to their unique backgrounds and cultural contexts and use the elements of music. In this integrated multi-subject objective, I have further refined that so that we will be creating a piece of devised theater using a storybook as the starting point. So devised theater really is basically making a collaborative piece of theater with just one thing to begin with, and everyone collaborates off that same thing. The students will also retell the storybook, and they will pick their own role, actor, writer, musician, and they will perform their original piece for their peers. Celia Cruz, Queen of Salsa, is the starting point for our project-based inquiry into the music life and activism of Celia Cruz. This book details the history of her life, music, and her activism. Prior to beginning this project, I was able to meet with the students and conduct an informal interview where we exchanged questions and answers of one another. And during this session, I learned that this group is extremely curious and very creative. This is further evidenced by our group discussion. I asked the students to share opinions of their favorite ways of learning. And after a more general discussion, I narrowed down the questions to gauge their interests in each of the project's entry points. The results were very clear. The majority of students really wanted to act and make music, and a smaller number of them were interested in writing and behind-the-scenes work. They also expressed frustration and disinterest in their current English language arts unit in nonfiction. After we looked at the book and I read them the storybook, they were very surprised to find out that this book was nonfiction, and they were excited about it because they found a nonfiction book they were actually interested in as opposed to whatever's being provided at the moment in the Common Core curriculum that they're doing at that school. We discussed Celia Cruz, we discussed her contributions to music and Latinx culture, and we listened to some audio and video clips. So a lot of the students had heard her music. Not that many of them knew her name, which makes sense because they're only 9 and 10 years old. Most of them were excited about the music and enthusiastic. And as we discussed, like that they could choose the roles and they could write the scripts and they could basically create the whole thing and even have involvement with the assessment, there was a very moving experience in terms of the level of engagement the students started with and then subsequently ended with when I was leaving that interview class. So I was pretty excited and felt like, okay, the difference between their contributions upon meeting me until now was palpable. So I knew, okay, this is working. This is, they're feeling this. And this seems like they're in agreement. This is a great place to start our inquiry. We are absolutely going to, scaffold from the Illinois State Standards for language, theater, and music. There is some primary objectives that I've outlined in here that are further evidenced and scaffolded in the unit and lesson plans. Essentially, we start off by picking that primary artistic entry point I discussed of writer, music, or dramatist, actor. Then the students choose how they're going to represent the beginning and the end of the storybook now in those groups. Then they're going to, in the third week, retell or create a different story depending on what they decide. They can retell straight out of the book we have, or they can make their own version of, as long as they include some of the information we talk about. They're going to have a day where they I love doing this, week 4, where they share, like they'll have one student in the group rotate so that they can do like the expert thing where that student basically tells them what they're working on in their group, and then they collaborate. After that collaboration, the students can switch groups if they'd like, which usually ends up, and when I've done the other projects in a similar vein, with students with a really neat mix of students with prior knowledge of a different role and students new to the role. So in week 5, that's a great time to do a student self-assessment, since we've gone through all of this different inquiry-based learning and really molding and improvising our work. After we've done the self-assessment, we're also going to, the students will give some peer feedback, and teacher feedback will happen. So students can use that to refine and complete their retelling of the story. Week 7's rehearsing and script writers creating invitations, and then we culminate in a performance. The summative assessment is based not just on the performance, but on the 8-week project and getting there. So there's some important benchmarks the students will be looking at, and one of them is definitely backward planning. So embedded in the unit and lesson plans is our deadlines for the making sure that the students have created those deadlines, and there's checkpoints to make sure that is in fact happening. So easy to get lost in these projects. The second mini goal is that self-assessment midpoint, so the students are really clear about their roles so far and what needs to happen to continue. The mini goal 3 is students adjusting and modifying their summative assessments. So I'll be showing that soon. The other important next step in terms of student choice and voice is, now that they've gotten to this point in the inquiry, it's really important that they get to choose leaders in their groups to manage in order to get through the performance. Much like any theatrical performance, there needs to be people in charge of the different parts of the performance. So there's a dramaturg that will be appointed who does script editing and fact checking. The conductor, who will not just direct the music, but also assign parts. You'll notice that I've put vocalists, percussionists, and DJs. So the students definitely have an option to do mixing of, Celia Cruz's music or other rhythms that they might think are related. The sky's the limit on how they create the music. So the conductor is going to help them limit that. The stage manager is a very important organized person. So luckily, usually every classroom has at least one very organized student, and that person will hopefully be the one they appoint to the rehearsal schedule, the crew members. And usually I recommend this would be in the writer group, because the actors and musicians, unless they're not performing, would not be able to do this role. The director is in charge of overseeing the whole thing, and especially the acting, blocking, stage activity, and is absolutely welcome to appoint an assistant director. As we've discussed, there are many, many decision points along the way, including taking on specific jobs, presenting information, how and when and why. We talked before about modifying groups. We talked about self and peer assessment. So a lot of student-led activity happening throughout. All of the classes are concurrently run between myself and the homeroom teacher. I do the theater and the music, and the homeroom teacher does the script writing and a writing-related activity. We will be formatively assessing them through student journal documents where they document and process, and they put their reflections on the process as well. They can share their contribution to the group. We have a rubric for that they can use for both themselves and their peers. And there's a feedback that we're going to do after self-assessment, as well as after the summative. The self and peer assessment rubric, at this point I have as a given, although students, if they really feel the need to, we certainly can edit this, because I do want them to feel that they are invited to partake in the assessment as well. So this is a pretty, simple way to scaffold, like, what are you doing and how are you contributing to the group for each student, so they can have different, really clear expectations of themselves and others. The summative assessment, it will be based definitely on process and product. That's very important, because so much of the work is really the first 7 classes. The 8th class is simply to show what we've put together. I think that's important. Anytime we have a performance, it's really important to focus on that. I know I was not taught that way. I was taught that everything's about the performance, and Project-based learning really is process-oriented, and I think it's a great opportunity for students who aren't used to being artists to be artists. So we have these summative rubric examples of the scriptwriters. And what I've done here is I've put in some ideas for the students relating to history, social justice, knowing their audiences, writing. These are absolutely welcome to be modified, changed, and added onto. All of the boxes are empty so the students can decide how those will look, what their criteria will be for each number, 1 through 4. Musicians, I've put in loosely rhythm, singing, form, and improvisation, and very, very specific goals related to this project therein. The actors, I've put in things, and again, all of these are related to the standards provided. This one does, look at some of the elements of acting, and it relates, again, very specifically to what we're doing in the project. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to telling you how it goes.